comes to Mark Meadows, this seems very important. When it comes to Mark Meadows, we also today got a brand new, previously unheard assertion from his top deputy, Cassidy Hutchinson, about what Mark Meadows did around this time and why he did it. Now, we don't know why they held this piece of Cassidy Hutchinson testimony until today, when we've heard so much from her in previous hearings, both on tape and in live testimony. But it is possible that the investigators on the January 6th committee have held this back until today. Mark Meadows, because they are continuing a legal battle with Mark Meadows to try to get him to testify to their investigation. This clip about Mark Meadows today points to Mark Meadows' state of mind, his intentions behind what he was doing, in a way that might prove to be a problem for him if he ever faces criminal charges in this matter.
During this period, I perceived his goal with all of this to keep Trump in office. He had very seriously and deeply considered the allegations of voter fraud. But when he began acknowledging that maybe there wasn't enough voter fraud to overturn the election, I witnessed him start to explore potential constitutional loopholes.
Okay, so here's the thing. Mark Meadows, the guy who was literally Trump's right-hand man for years, is now staring down the barrel of a jail cell. And I'm not talking about some distant future, maybe possibly scenario. I'm talking about a judge, an actual judge, delivering what's being called a final warning, like comply or go to jail. That's where we're at right now. And look, I know what you're thinking. You're probably like, yeah, another Trump ally in legal trouble. We've heard this before. But here's why this one hits different. This isn't just some random person in Trump's orbit. This is Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, the guy who was in the room for everything, the guy who knows where all the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking, of course. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
That moment was not a criminal referral of Mark Meadows to the Justice Department, but the investigators are handing the Justice Department basically both of the Lego pieces they would need to build a very simple, stable criminal case against him. Yeah.
So let's set the scene here. Meadows has been trying every legal trick in the book to get out of this Georgia case. And I mean, every trick. His big play was trying to move the whole thing from state court to federal court, because in his mind, if he could just get it to federal court, he'd have way more protection, more legal shields, better odds. That was the whole strategy. But here's the kicker. The Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, just told him no, flat out rejected his request back in November of last year. They didn't even want to hear arguments about it. They just looked at the request and said, nope, not interested. You're staying in Georgia. Deal with the consequences. And now the walls are really closing in, because without that federal court protection, Meadows is stuck in Georgia state court, facing charges that could actually put him behind bars. And the judge overseeing this whole mess just delivered what people are calling a final warning. This is it. No more games, no more delays, comply with the court orders, or face jail time. Real jail time. The judge has clearly run out of patience. Can you believe this? The former White House chief of staff, the guy who was literally running day-to-day operations for the president of the United States, is now being threatened with jail if he doesn't get his act together. Think about how wild that is. And here's what makes this even more wild. Meadows isn't just some side character in this story. He's one of 19 people. 19 who got indicted in Georgia for allegedly trying to overturn the 2020 election. And guess who else is on that list? Trump himself. So their legal fates are completely intertwined. What happens to Meadows could have massive implications for Trump. They're tied together in this massive RICO case. If one falls, it could bring down the others. If one cooperates, everyone else is at risk. Now let's talk about what Meadows actually did to get himself into this mess. The big thing, the really big thing, is his involvement in that infamous phone call. You know, the one where Trump called up Georgia's Secretary of State and basically pressured him to find votes. That phone call that got leaked and caused this massive scandal. The one where you could hear Trump literally asking for someone to find exactly the number of votes he needed to win. And Meadows was right there. He was on that call. He was part of making it happen. He helped set it up. And now the legal system is saying, hey, that wasn't part of your official federal duties. That was campaign stuff. That was trying to manipulate an election. And you don't get immunity for that. So all those arguments Meadows has been making about how he was just doing his job as chief of staff, yeah, judges aren't buying it. And this is where things get really interesting. Because if Meadows is facing jail time, if he's looking at actually going behind bars, what do you think he's going to do? You think he's just going to take one for the team? Come on. We've seen this movie before. When people start facing real consequences, when the threat of jail becomes real, that's when they start thinking about cutting deals, about flipping, about telling prosecutors everything they know in exchange for leniency. And Meadows knows everything. Like everything. He was in every meeting, every phone call. If he decides to cooperate, if he decides to tell prosecutors what really went down, that could blow this whole thing wide open. So yeah, this isn't just another legal story about another Trump ally. This is potentially the domino that starts a whole chain reaction. This is the moment where everything could change. And for Trump, who's built his entire political career on loyalty, the idea of Meadows flipping has got to be terrifying. Alright, so let's dig into why this Meadows situation is such a huge deal. Because on the surface, you might think, okay, another Trump person in legal trouble, add it to the pile. But when you really understand what's going on here, when you see the bigger picture, it's actually pretty wild. First off, let's talk about this whole federal immunity thing, because that's been Meadows' entire strategy from day one. His lawyers have been arguing that everything he did as White House chief of staff was part of his official duties. Therefore, he should have immunity. Therefore, he can't be prosecuted in state court. It's been the centerpiece of his entire legal defense. If they could get the case moved to federal court, everything changes. Different judges, different juries, different legal standards. And look, on paper, that sounds like it could work. I mean, if you're working for the president, doing president stuff, shouldn't you have some protection? The whole point of federal immunity is to protect government officials so they can do their jobs without constantly worrying about getting sued or prosecuted for every decision they make. That's the theory anyway. And Meadows' lawyers have been pushing that theory hard. But here's where it falls apart. And this is what the courts have been saying over and over again. There's a massive difference between official government duties and political campaign activities. Like, huge difference. And what Meadows was involved in with that Georgia phone call, that wasn't government business. That was campaign stuff. That was trying to help Trump win an election. The judges looked at this and basically said, yeah, no, you can't claim federal immunity for trying to manipulate election results. That's not what that protection is for. Not when you're making political phone calls to try to overturn election results. That's crossing a line that immunity doesn't cover. And this matters. This really matters. Because it sets a precedent. It says that just because you work in the White House doesn't mean you can do whatever you want and hide behind immunity. There are limits. And trying to overturn an election, that's way over the line. This is the courts drawing a boundary and saying this far and no further. So when the Supreme Court refused to hear Meadows' appeal back in November, that was basically the final nail in the coffin for his federal immunity strategy. The highest court in the land looked at his request and said, nope, we're not even going to hear this. You're staying in Georgia State Court. Deal with it. And can you imagine being Meadows in that moment? You've spent months building this whole legal strategy around getting the case moved to federal court. You've got expensive lawyers, really expensive lawyers. And then the Supreme Court just shuts you down. Just no. And suddenly your entire legal strategy collapses. That's got to be devastating. Because now you're stuck. You're in Georgia State Court with no way out. And the charges you're facing, they're serious. We're talking RICO charges, which is basically organized crime stuff. The same type of charges they use to go after mob bosses and drug cartels. And the penalties can be severe. We're talking decades in prison, if convicted. This isn't some white-collar crime where you might get probation. This is serious hard time. And this brings us to the current situation. The judge overseeing this case has clearly had enough of the delays, had enough of the legal maneuvering. So now we're getting these warnings, these final warnings, like get in line or go to jail. And sources close to the proceedings are saying the risk of jail is very real now. This isn't just tough talk. This is actual. If you don't follow court orders, if you don't show up when you're supposed to, you could be held in contempt. And contempt means jail, immediate jail. Now, let's talk about what this means for Trump. Because remember, Meadows and Trump are co-defendants in this Georgia case. They're both charged under the same RICO indictment. So what happens to one directly affects the other. If Meadows' immunity argument failed, what does that say about Trump's similar arguments? If Meadows is facing jail time for not complying, what pressure does that put on Trump? And here's the thing that has to be keeping Trump up at night. If Meadows decides to cooperate, if he decides to cut a deal with prosecutors, he could absolutely bury Trump because Meadows was there for everything. He was in the Oval Office. He was on the phone calls. He saw the planning. He knows what Trump said in private versus what Trump said in public. Like, think about how valuable that testimony would be to prosecutors. You've got the former chief of staff, the guy who was literally Trump's closest advisor, saying, yeah, here's what really happened. Here's what Trump really said. Here's what we were really trying to do. That's devastating. And we've seen this pattern before with Trump associates. Remember Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer and fixer? He ended up cooperating. He ended up testifying against Trump. He provided documents. He provided testimony. He provided inside information about how Trump operated. So the question becomes, is Meadows the next Michael Cohen? Is he the next person who decides that loyalty to Trump isn't worth going to prison over? And let's be real here. Prison is scary, especially for someone like Meadows, who's used to power and privilege. The idea of trading that life for a prison cell, that's a tough sell. Think about what prison would mean for someone like him. No more fancy dinners, no more political influence. Instead, you're in a cell, eating terrible food, following orders from guards. For someone who's used to being at the top of the power structure, that's a nightmare scenario. Plus, and this is important, Meadows has a family. He has a life outside of Trump world. At some point, you've got to ask yourself, is protecting Trump worth sacrificing everything else? Is it worth losing years of your life locked up? These are the questions Meadows is facing right now. And the fact that the judge just delivered this final warning, that makes those questions even more urgent, even more real. And here's another angle that doesn't get talked about enough. The other co-defendants in this case are watching what happens to Meadows. They're seeing how he handles this, and that's going to influence their own decisions. If Meadows flips, if he cuts a deal, that could start a domino effect. Other defendants might think, well, if Meadows is cooperating, maybe I should too. And suddenly you've got a race to cooperate. Because the first person to cooperate usually gets the best deal, the best plea agreement, the lightest sentence. And that's a nightmare scenario for Trump. Because once people start flipping, once people start telling prosecutors everything, it becomes really hard to defend against. How do you fight multiple witnesses who were in the room with you, who saw what you did? The legal experts looking at this case are saying that Meadows is in one of the toughest positions of any defendant. He's got significant exposure, he's got limited defenses, and he's got a judge who's clearly lost patience. And you know what else makes this interesting? The timing. We're in Trump's second term right now. There are multiple legal cases happening simultaneously. The political pressure is intense. The media attention is constant. And every development in one case affects all the other cases. So when Meadows gets this final warning from the judge, that's not happening in a vacuum. That's happening while everyone is watching. While political opponents are pointing and saying, see what happens when you break the rules. But here's the reality. The courts don't care about the spin. The judges don't care about the political narratives. They care about the law. They care about the evidence. They care about whether defendants are complying with court orders. And right now, Meadows is on thin ice. So yeah, this Meadows situation is way bigger than just one guy facing legal problems. This is potentially the spark that ignites a much larger fire. This is potentially the moment where Trump's whole legal defense strategy starts to crumble. Because if Meadows goes down, or worse, if Meadows cooperates, everything changes. Okay, so let's break this down into the key points you need to understand, because there's a lot going on here, and it's easy to get lost in all the legal jargon. But when you cut through all that, there are really 3 or 4 core things that matter. Point number 1, Meadows is out of options. Like, he's tried everything, he's appealed to every court he can appeal to, and none of it worked. The Supreme Court shut him down. The federal court shut him down. He's stuck in Georgia State Court, and there's no way out. Every door has been closed. Every escape route has been blocked. His legal options have been exhausted. And why does this matter? Because Georgia State Court is where he doesn't want to be. That's where the charges are serious. That's where the evidence is strong. That's where he's most vulnerable. If he could have gotten to federal court, he might have had better odds. But that door is closed now. He's facing a Georgia jury, Georgia prosecutors, Georgia judges, and they're not going to go easy on him just because he used to work in the White House. Point number 2, the immunity argument failed spectacularly. And this is huge, because it wasn't just Meadows betting on this strategy. A lot of Trump's legal defense has been built around the idea that official acts get immunity, and the courts just demolished it. Said no, that's not how this works. You don't get immunity for campaign activities. You don't get immunity for trying to overturn elections. That's not official government business. The courts drew a clear line and said this is where immunity stops. This is where accountability begins. And think about how this applies to Trump himself. Trump has been making similar immunity arguments in his own cases. But if the courts are saying Meadows doesn't have immunity for campaign-related stuff, what does that mean for Trump's immunity claims? It's not looking good. The legal theory that both of them have been relying on just got shot down by multiple courts, including the Supreme Court. Point number 3. The threat of jail is real and immediate. This isn't some future possibility that might happen years from now. The judge in this case has made it clear, comply or face jail time. And sources are saying this is a genuine threat. The judge isn't playing around anymore. The patience has run out. And this is where the psychology gets interesting. Because when you're facing abstract legal problems, like maybe you'll get convicted someday, it's easy to stay tough, easy to stay loyal. But when a judge looks you in the eye and says you could be going to jail next week if you don't comply, that changes things. That makes it real. And suddenly all those calculations about loyalty versus self-preservation, they get a lot more urgent. When the threat is right in front of you, your thinking changes, your priorities shift. Point number 4. The cooperation question is now front and center. Will Meadows flip? Will he cut a deal? That's the $1 million question right now. And look, we don't know what Meadows is going to do, but we can look at the incentives, and the incentives to cooperate are pretty strong right now. He's looking at serious prison time. If convicted, he's out of legal options. He's facing an immediate threat of jail if he doesn't comply, and he knows things, important things, that prosecutors would love to hear. So if you're Meadows, what do? Do you risk decades in prison to protect Trump, or do you try to save yourself? That's a brutal calculation, but it's the one he's making right now. Now let's talk about why this matters beyond just Meadows, because this is about more than one person's legal troubles. This is about accountability. This is about whether people in power can break the rules and get away with it. For years, there's been this sense that people at the highest levels of government operate under different rules. And a lot of people are tired of that. They want to see actual consequences for actual wrongdoing. So when you see someone like Meadows, who was one of the most powerful people in the country, actually facing real legal jeopardy, that's significant. That says maybe the rules do apply to everyone. Maybe you can't just do whatever you want when you're in power. And then there's the political angle. What happens with Meadows could have major political implications. If he cooperates, if he provides damaging testimony about Trump, that's going to be in the news cycle constantly. And for Trump, who's always been obsessed with loyalty, having a former chief of staff flip on him, that's got to sting. And it raises questions about who else might flip. So where does this go from here? Well, we're waiting to see if Meadows complies with the court orders. We're waiting to see if he faces any jail time for contempt. We're waiting to see if he decides to cooperate with prosecutors. And we're waiting to see how all of this affects Trump's own legal situation. But one thing is clear. The walls are closing in. The legal system is moving forward. And the days of endless delays are coming to an end. And here's the thing that nobody's really talking about. This could be just the beginning. Meadows might be the first domino. But if he falls, if he cooperates, who's next? Who else in Trump's orbit is facing similar pressure? We could be looking at a cascade effect here. A situation where one person flipping leads to another person flipping. And before you know it, the whole thing unravels. The legal analysts following this case are saying that we're at a critical juncture, that the next few weeks could determine not just Meadows' fate, but potentially the fate of multiple defendants in this case, including Trump himself. Because here's the reality. If Meadows goes to jail and stays quiet, Trump's team will breathe a sigh of relief. But if Meadows cooperates, if he starts talking, the entire calculation changes. Suddenly other defendants are looking at that and thinking maybe I should get ahead of this. So keep your eyes on this one. Because what happens with Mark Meadows in the next few weeks could reshape the entire political and legal landscape. This is the kind of story that starts small and ends up changing everything. And we'll be here covering every twist and every turn as it happens. Because this is far from over. In fact, it feels like it's just getting started. The judge has spoken. The warning has been delivered. And now we wait to see what Meadows does next. Does he comply? Does he cooperate? Does he go to jail? Whatever happens, it's going to be big. And it's going to have ripple effects that none of us can fully predict right now. This is the moment. This is where everything could change. And we're watching it happen in real time.